A woman's hand on limestone, 5 fingers pressed flat against the interior wall of a cave in the Black Hills, Dakota Territory. The date July 21st, 1876, 7 days after her husband died. The stone is cool, not cold. Rebecca Clark does not yet know this sensation will save her life. Rebecca has $11. She is 4 months pregnant. The journey home to Iowa costs $23. The arithmetic is simple. The answer is devastating. She cannot leave. Every man on French Creek will run out of firewood by February. Their cabins, solid, well-built, heated every night, will drop to 14 degrees by dawn. Rebecca's cave, heated only in the evenings, will hold 43 degrees through the same winter nights. The difference is not the wood. The difference is the walls. She pulls her hand back from the stone steps out into the July heat, 80 degrees thick with the smell of fever still in the canvas tent below. Christopher Wright's body is cooling on the bedroll. The picks on the creek keep striking rock. The gold rush does not pause for one man's death. This is not a story about gold. Christopher came for gold and found none. This is a story about a different kind of finding, the kind where you put your hand on cool stone in July and measure the temperature in September and calculate firewood in October and keep a child alive through 2 winters at 7,000 feet without ever getting sick. Not once. How does a 21-year-old widow with no money, no help, and a newborn survive 2 Black Hills winters in a cave, while miners with cabins and experience freeze? The answer is written in 3 numbers on brown paper: 54 degrees, 43 degrees, 7 pieces of wood per day. Rebecca does not know the phrase thermal mass. She does not know limestone has a volumetric heat capacity 4 times greater than dry wood. She knows the stone is cool when the air is hot. She files this fact the way she files every fact, silently, precisely, without knowing when she will use it. She will use it in 3 months to stake her life and her daughter's life upon. On the coldest night of winter, minus 20 degrees outside the cave, will drop to 41. Just 1 degree above the threshold where an infant can sleep safely under wool. 1 degree. 1 extra piece of oak in the evening fire. 1 measurement. 1 decision. 1 child who lives. Council Bluffs, Iowa, January 14, 1876. Rebecca Ward married Christopher Wright in a ceremony that took 11 minutes. She was 21. Christopher was 23. They had known each other since autumn, when Christopher began buying horseshoes from Rebecca's father, Timothy Moore, a blacksmith, not wealthy, not poor, sufficient. The wedding was attended by her parents, his parents, her brother Brandon, 3 younger sisters, his 2 brothers, and a minister who had a cold and kept the vows brief. The temperature outside was 15 degrees. Inside the church it was 40. Everyone kept their coats on. Christopher was the 3rd son of a farming family. The farm had enough land for 2 sons. The first 2 sons took the land. Christopher received advice: go find your place. He had been reading newspaper accounts of gold in the Black Hills. Custer's 1874 expedition had found color in the streams, and by early 1876, thousands of men were pouring into Deadwood and the surrounding creeks. Despite the fact that the land belonged to the Lakota people by the Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in 1868, which the United States government was in the active process of violating. Christopher did not think about the treaty. He thought about gold. He was 23 years old, with the particular optimism of 23. The conviction that the right place and the right time are the same, and that you are there, was the fuel that carried him from Iowa to Dakota Territory. It was not a plan. It was a direction. Rebecca did not share this optimism. She did not oppose it either. She married Christopher because he was kind, because he had a direction when many men around her did not, and because in 1876 the idea that a wife might decline to follow her husband to the place he was going did not exist in any framework she had access to. No one told her she could stay. No one told her she could not go. The question simply did not form. She packed the household goods, the wool blanket her mother had given her, the cooking pots, the camp stove, and went. The camp stove deserves its own introduction because it will save her life. It was a cast-iron box stove, small with a shallow firebox designed for a farmhouse kitchen, not for a mining camp. But Christopher brought it because his father had always had a cast-iron stove. And Christopher was the kind of man who carried the things his father carried without articulating why. The stove weighed approximately 40 pounds. On the journey from Iowa to the Black Hills, those 40 pounds rode on the back of the mule alongside the pick and the pan and the provisions. Rebecca had asked during packing, "Do we need the stove? We could cook over an open fire." Christopher's answer was immediate. Certain Dad always had a stove. That was the entire reason. And that stove, that logic, Christopher's loyalty, 40 pounds of cast iron on a mule's back for 700 miles, would become the center of everything Rebecca built in the next 2 years. The thermometer was Christopher's too. Part of his prospecting kit, meant for checking when the creek water was approaching the freeze point, which mattered for placer mining. Rebecca packed it because she packed everything that looked like it had a function. She did not know in April 1876 what function it would serve for her. She knew it measured temperature. That was enough reason to bring it. They left Council Bluffs in early April. 3 weeks overland through Nebraska and into Dakota Territory. The land changed. Iowa's cultivated plains gave way to the grass hills of Nebraska, then to the pine ridges of the Black Hills. Rebecca watched the changes the way she watched everything, closely, quietly, storing observations she had no immediate use for. She noticed limestone outcrops on the hillsides as they entered the Black Hills, the same type of stone she had seen in Iowa, where farmers pulled field stone from the glacial till when they broke sod and stacked it into fences along their property lines. She remembered the stone fence at the Wilson place in Council Bluffs, how her mother, Angela Young, had pointed at it once when Rebecca was small and asked, "Do you see where this stone sits compared to the gap below it?" One question, not a lesson. And Rebecca had answered that question with her eyes every time she passed a stone fence afterward for 15 years, until the answer lived in her hands as naturally as holding a pencil. French Creek, May, 1876. Christopher staked a position on the limestone slope above the creek set. The tent began panning. The creek was crowded, dozens of men working claims upstream and downstream, the water carrying silt and the particular sharp smell of turned gravel. Deadwood was 2 hours' walk to the north, a mud camp of 1,200 people, canvas tents, plank buildings going up fast, the sound of picks hitting rock audible from the creek in the early morning quiet. Rebecca discovered she was pregnant in May. She told Christopher, "We'll find enough gold before winter." The words came out easy, confident. Rebecca said nothing. She knew before winter was a promise Christopher made to himself, not to reality. But she had no framework to challenge it. She had never been here, never seen winter here. And Christopher was confident, and the confidence of a husband in 1876 was not something a 21-year-old wife had tools to push against. She asked one question Christopher could not answer. What is winter like here? Christopher did not know. He had not asked. He was thinking about gold. Winter was somewhere past the gold, and the goal was close. Every pan brought a few flakes. Not enough, but enough to believe more was coming. That was the particular mathematics of a gold rush. Not enough today was evidence of enough tomorrow if you read the signs correctly, which every man on the creek believed he did. On a morning in May, Christopher climbed the limestone slope above French Creek, looking for color in the rock face. He did not find gold. He found a cave. The mouth was 4 feet wide and 8 feet tall, opening into the hillside at an angle that kept it out of the direct sun for most of the day. He went in 12 feet before the passage narrowed to a crack that continued deeper into the limestone, but was too tight for a person to follow. The floor of the wide section was dry. The cave opened at a height that kept groundwater from entering, and the angle of the passage directed any water that did enter along the south wall and out the mouth rather than pooling inside. The ceiling was 8 feet at the entrance, dropping to 6 at the back, roughly vaulted with a fissure running along the upper surface that Christopher noted but did not examine closely. He came back to camp and the words tumbled out before thought. "I found a place to put the tools when the rain comes." A storage room. That was what Christopher saw. A dry space in the hillside to keep the picks and pans out of the weather. He saw the cave the way a man looking for gold sees everything in terms of its utility to the search. The cave was useful as a shed. He did not see it as anything else. Rebecca went with him to look at the cave the next day. She stepped inside. The air was cooler than outside, noticeably immediately the way stepping into a root cellar in Iowa was cooler. She looked at the ceiling, the floor, the walls, the fissure. She put her hand on the interior wall. Cool, not cold. The intermediate temperature that stone holds when it is insulated from surface temperature swings by its own mass. She did not think this could be a home. She thought nothing she could put into words. She felt the stone and she stored the feeling, and she did not know. Standing there in May 1876 with Christopher alive in the summer ahead and gold in the creek theoretically, that in 11 weeks Christopher would be dead, and the feeling of cool stone under her palm would be the most important thing she possessed. During a summer thunderstorm, Christopher and Rebecca sheltered in the cave. Christopher decided to try fitting the stovepipe from the cast iron stove into the fissure in the ceiling. The fissure drew. Smoke went up through the crack in the limestone and exited the hillside through a surface crack somewhere above. Chimney courtesy of the Almighty. Christopher laughed. Rebecca did not laugh. She watched the smoke rise and disappear into stone. And she thought, this crack pulls air. If it pulls smoke up, it pulls warm air up. Does that mean the cave loses heat through the crack? Or does the crack seal itself when there is no fire? She did not have answers. She had questions, and at this stage questions were more valuable than answers. The neighbors. Kenneth Walker, 42 years old, had a cabin on the slope near the cave, a standard log structure he built in early summer. 12 by 14 feet, 8-inch diameter logs notched at the corners. The kind of cabin a man who has built 5 cabins in 5 mining camps builds without thinking much about it. Kenneth knew wood. He knew the sound of an axe hitting dense hardwood versus soft sapwood. He knew how much firewood a cabin needed to get through a mountain winter. He would be the first person to look at Rebecca's woodpile in October and say what he believed to be true. That won't last you to February. He would be wrong, but the wrongness would not be his fault. It would be the fault of a variable he did not know existed. Shirley Allen, 38 years old, from Ohio, married to Kenneth, had delivered 11 children in her own home before coming to the Black Hills the previous spring. She was the kind of woman who noticed who needed what, not from charity, but from the instinct of a mother of 11. The scan is automatic, the assessment is constant, the help is practical. She noticed Rebecca was pregnant before Rebecca said so because Shirley had seen it 11 times in herself, and the signs were legible to her at 30 paces. Shirley did not say anything until Rebecca said it first. That was how women on the frontier respected each other, by not saying what the other person was not ready to hear. Kenneth was a serious miner. He built his cabin well, solid logs, tight notches, a good fireplace. He would cut 2.5 cords of firewood in October, substantially more than Rebecca would cut, and his cabin would be cold by Christmas. His wood would be gone by the end of December, and he would go back out in January in -15 air to cut more and come back with cracked red hands and the cough that followed days in extreme cold. The cough that would not leave until March. The same winter, the same elevation, the same wood species, different structures, different physics, different outcomes. Christopher Wright began running a fever on July 2, 1876. By July 5th, he could not stand. Rebecca recognized it. Typhoid. She had seen it in Iowa, the Wilson boy, 14 years old, who died in 10 days despite the doctor visiting. The water in French Creek was contaminated. Hundreds of miners were dumping waste into the same water they drank. The connection between fouled water and typhoid was understood by some physicians in 1876, but not by the men fouling the water, and not consistently by the men drinking it. Rebecca did not call the doctor in Deadwood. The doctor, a man who claimed to have practiced in St. Louis, though no one had verified this, charged $5 per visit, nearly half her remaining money. And she knew from the Wilson boy that typhoid in 1876 had no cure. The doctor could visit or not visit. The fever would run its course either way. Shirley Allen came to help in the final days. The two women took turns cooling Christopher with wet cloths. Shirley did not offer false comfort. If he makes it past day 10, he might pull through. Her voice was level factual. Christopher did not make it past day 12. On day 8, during a lucid interval, Christopher spoke to Rebecca. Not love words, not farewell. The words of a farmer's son, practical to the bone. The stove is in the cave. Don't sell the mule. 2 sentences. Specific. About tools. Christopher loved the way farmers love through objects, through things that keep people alive. The stove and the mule were the 2 most practically valuable things he owned. And in his fever clarity, with the part of his brain that was still calculating even as the rest was shutting down, he identified them and told his wife to keep them. He did not say, "I love you." He said stove and mule. And those 2 words or those 2 tools would keep 2 people alive for 2 years. Christopher died on the afternoon of July 14, 1876. The temperature outside was approximately 80 degrees. Inside the tent, hotter. Rebecca sat beside him. She heard through the canvas the sound of picks striking rock. Other men still digging, because a gold rush does not pause for one man's death. No one outside the tent knew Christopher had died until that evening when Shirley walked down to the creek and told Donald Harris, and Harris told others. 2 miners came to help dig the grave on the slope above the tent. There was no minister, no formal service. Rebecca stood beside the grave with Shirley. She did not cry in front of them, not from hardness, but because she had only ever cried indoors with the door closed, and here there was no door to close. That evening Rebecca returned to the tent alone. This was the first night in her life she slept alone. In Iowa she had shared a room with her sisters, then a bed with Christopher. She lay in the tent and heard insects, the creek, the distant sound of a pick striking rock, someone mining at night by lantern, because the gold did not care about the clock. And she realized something she did not put into words but understood, the way you understand the floor is solid when you stand on it. From this night every decision was hers. There was no one to ask, no one to follow. This was not liberation. This was not oppression. This was the fact of her situation. The way temperature is a fact, and the distance to Iowa is a fact, and $11 is a fact. And Rebecca was a person who believed facts. The week after Christopher died. 7 days of arithmetic. Rebecca sat on a flat rock by French Creek. The rock she would return to many times, the rock that served as her desk when the world required calculation. And she worked through the numbers on the back of a piece of brown provision wrapping paper using Christopher's pencil. $11 in the possibles bag. Stage to Cheyenne, $9. Rail from Cheyenne to Council Bluffs, at least 14. Total to get home, 23. She had 11, short 12. She could sell the mule. The mule might bring 15 in Deadwood, but without the mule she could not transport the stove, the tools, the provisions. And she was 4 months pregnant and could not walk 200 miles to Cheyenne. She crossed out that line. She could stay in Deadwood. There was work for women, washing, cooking, the other services that men in a mining camp would pay for. But she was 4 months pregnant. By November she would not be able to work. And a woman who could not work in Deadwood in winter had no income, no shelter. The rooming houses charged by the week. No money meant the street plus a newborn plus a tent plus a Black Hills winter. She crossed out Deadwood. The cave. Free, dry, large enough. No deed required, no one owned a cave in the limestone hills. No money needed for lumber. No man needed to build it. No permission needed from anyone. Rebecca did not choose the cave because she knew it would maintain superior overnight temperatures with lower fuel consumption than a log cabin. She chose the cave because it was the only thing she could have without money, without help, and without asking. The reason she chose the cave was desperation. The reason the cave saved her was physics. The two were unrelated, and that is the nature of the story. She moved into the cave in August. She brought the canvas from the tent, the cooking gear, the food stores that Christopher had bought in Deadwood in June, enough to last until roughly October if she was careful, and the cast iron stove. She placed the stove against the back wall of the cave, fitted the stovepipe into the natural fissure in the ceiling that Christopher had tested during the summer storm. The fissure drew, smoke went up and out. The first night in the cave she lay on the limestone floor. No bed yet. She would build one later. The floor was dry, flat, cold. Not winter cold. The slow, patient cold of stone that pulls heat from a body continuously without wind, without interruption, just the steady draw of warmth downward into rock that is always cooler than a living person. She understood immediately, in the way that you understand a hot surface is hot the moment you touch it, not after analysis, that she could not sleep on this floor through a winter. She needed a raised bed with air beneath it. She filed this. She would build one. The second fact she filed came at the end of August during a late summer thunderstorm. The temperature outside dropped to 50 degrees. Rebecca was in the cave. No fire. In the morning she checked the thermometer. Christopher's thermometer, which she had placed on a stack of provision sacks at the approximate height where a sleeping body would be. 54 degrees inside, 50 outside. The cave had not followed the weather down. The tent would have been 50 or lower canvas holds, nothing but rain, and sometimes not even that. The cave held 54 without fire through a night when the outside temperature dropped 4 degrees below it. She took Christopher's pencil and wrote on the brown paper 54. She did not know why the cave did this. She knew the cave did this, and she began to think, if the cave holds 54, when outside is 50, what does it hold when outside is 0? When outside is -5. She did not know the answer, but she had the thermometer. And September was coming, and September nights in the Black Hills were colder than August nights. She would measure. To understand why Rebecca's firewood lasted through a Black Hills winter, you must first understand why the firewood of every man around her did not. A gold rush settlement is organized around mobility and optimism in a way that makes it structurally different from a homestead community. In a homestead community, the kind Rebecca grew up in, families commit to the land. They build for permanence. They share knowledge across winters. A gold rush does none of this. The majority expect to leave as soon as they strike it rich. And winter is an interruption of gold seeking rather than a season to prepare for. Men who expect to be wealthy and gone by spring do not build proper winter infrastructure. They build minimum. They cut less wood than they need because they expect to be somewhere else before the wood runs out. This is not stupidity. It is the rational behavior of people who believe their current situation is temporary. The problem is that gold rush math is brutal. The number who find enough gold to leave rich is approximately 3%. The other 97% stay through the winter they did not prepare for in cabins built to minimum standard, burning through wood they cut on the assumption they would not need it. Kenneth Walker was in the 97%. He built a solid cabin better than most, but with the unconscious assumption that it was temporary. He cut 2.5 cords with the unconscious assumption he would be somewhere warmer before they ran out. When December came and the gold had not, he was in a well-built temporary cabin with an insufficient wood supply. And the winter was not temporary at all. Rebecca was not operating in this frame. She had no claim to work, no gold to expect. Her project was not gold. Her project was surviving the winter with a newborn, which was a project with clear inputs and outputs. Firewood, shelter, temperature, infant health. The winter was not an interruption of her project. The winter was her project. She prepared for it accordingly. September arrived the way autumn arrives in the Black Hills, not gradually but by one night. One night the air still held summer's warmth. The next night the wind from the north brought the dry, sharp cold that Rebecca had never felt in Iowa. Cold without moisture to soften it. Cold that cut clean. The thermometer read 35 degrees on that first September morning. Rebecca read the number and knew summer was done. She decided to sleep in the cave for one continuous week. This was not a scientific experiment. Rebecca did not have that word and did not need it. She called it trying out sleeping here. The kind of phrase any frontier woman in 1876 would use for the act of lying down in a new place and seeing whether it killed you. But the way she conducted it did not match the casualness of the phrase. She measured 3 times each night at the same times in the same position. The thermometer on the raised sleeping area she had improvised from folded canvas and provision sacks at the approximate height her body would occupy when lying down. Before lighting the fire, baseline temperature. After extinguishing the fire, peak temperature. The following morning before relighting, overnight low. She burned the stove 2 to 3 hours each evening. Ponderosa pine to start fast lighting resinous quick heat, then 2 pieces of bur oak to sustain dense and slow burning, then extinguished it, then slept. The numbers on the brown paper in Christopher's pencil in Rebecca's compact handwriting. Baseline 51, post-fire 62, morning low 44 to 48. On the coldest September night, outside temperature 31 degrees, the cave held 44 through the night. No fire. 13 degrees above outside. 13 degrees that the stone held when canvas would have surrendered them in the first hour. She compared in her mind the previous winter Iowa in the tent with Christopher. Mornings in the tent were the same temperature as outside or colder when the wind blew through the canvas. The tent held nothing. The cave held 13 degrees. What was the cave holding? The limestone around her, thousands of pounds of it forming the walls and ceiling and floor, was absorbing heat from the stove during the 3 evening hours and releasing it slowly through the night. Slowly because the cave walls were not thin partitions. They were continuous rock, 10 feet thick, 20, 30, and heat had to travel through the entire depth before escaping. A log cabin fire goes out and heat passes through 6 inches of wood in a few hours. Cabin reaches outside temperature by 2 in the morning. A limestone cave fire goes out and heat begins its journey through 10 feet of rock and does not arrive at the other side in one night. The cave held. Rebecca did not think in these terms. She thought morning 44 degrees, no fire needed, overnight warm enough to sleep under a blanket. Her version and the scientific version said the same thing in different languages. Both were correct. She kept the brown paper with the numbers. 6 readings that would become the empirical foundation of everything she planned from September forward. In September, Rebecca began building the wall. The cave mouth, 4 feet wide, 8 feet tall, was adequate for daytime shelter, but the Black Hills winter was not daytime. Temperatures below -20 common in January and February, with wind off the northern plains driving through every gap. An open cave mouth 4 feet wide in a Black Hills January was not a door. It was a wall missing. She had no saw and lumber. She had the stone of the hillside. She had time. And she had something she did not think of as knowledge, but which was knowledge. She had looked at stone fences in Iowa. The limestone slope above French Creek was covered with flat-faced stones that had spalled off the parent formation through years of weathering. Rebecca climbed the slope each morning 6 months pregnant in September and selected each stone individually. She looked for pieces with 2 flat faces, weight she could carry, dimensions that matched the position she was building. She spent more time selecting than placing. Anyone who has built with stone understands 70% of dry stonework is selection. She built from the ground up in horizontal courses, each stone placed to overlap the joint between the 2 stones below it. The running bond, the staggered joint, the principle that distributes load so that no single joint runs continuously from base to top. She had learned this not from instruction, but from observation of the stone fences of Iowa and from her mother's single question at the Wilson place years ago about where a stone sat in relation to the gap below it. The fences that used this principle still stood. The fences that did not had fallen and were gone. The specific challenge at the cave mouth was different from a freestanding fence. The limestone face around the opening was irregular pockets and protrusions where the rock had fractured and weathered. Each course had to match the uneven backing surface behind it while presenting a flat face on the outside. This was a 3-dimensional problem. Each stone needed to fit with the stone below the stone beside and the rock face behind. All at once. Rebecca solved it by eye and by hand. 1 stone at a time through September. She worked mornings, rested afternoons. Her body told her when to stop, and she listened because ignoring what your body tells you at 7,000 feet with no doctor is not toughness. It is stupidity. Rebecca was not stupid. As the wall rose, the stones got smaller. Not because the hillside stones were different at the top, but because the weight Rebecca could lift decreased as lifting height increased. and her pregnancy advanced. At the lower courses, she lifted to shoulder height. At the upper courses above her head, 7 months pregnant, every stone was a balanced problem her body solved fresh each time. She compensated with more stones per foot. Smaller pieces, more careful selection and placement. The top courses carried the marks of their making the work of a person at the limit of physical capacity, using attention to compensate for what strength could no longer provide. She did not mortar. Dry stone walls do not need it, and mortar creates problems when stones settle because it locks them rigidly while settlement forces crack it. A dry stone wall settles and you add stones at the top where gaps open. Rebecca's wall would settle slightly through the first winter. She would add stones after that. Stable. She left an opening for the door 4 feet tall, 3 feet wide. The door she made from boards of 3 supply crates obtained from Ronald King, the deadwood merchant. King had stacks of empty crates behind his building, pine boards worthless to him, taking up space. Rebecca proposed direct trade. 3 rounds of laundry for 3 crates. King looked at the crates, looked at her, nodded. He did not ask why a pregnant woman needed crate boards. In a gold rush camp, people needed strange things for practical reasons, and the practical reasons were their own business. Both sides got value. That is how frontier economics worked when it worked. Pine boards nailed to 2 horizontal rails, leather hinges cut from spare harness leather in Christopher's gear. The door was not square. The cave mouth was not square. Gaps around the edges admitted cold air. Rebecca stuffed these with strips of canvas, pressing fabric into cracks with a stick until the gaps were closed. The canvas would compress and need replacing twice during the 2 winters. When the wall was done and the door hung, she stood outside and looked. From the trail below, a section of dry stone wall with a wooden door set into the face of the rock. It looked like the front wall of a house built into the hillside. The prospectors passing on the trail began calling it the Stone Cabin. Rebecca did not correct them. October. Rebecca split firewood. 7 months pregnant now. The work required more rest between sessions than it had in August. The timber available on the slope came in 2 species with complementary burning characteristics that served the cave's needs better than either alone would have. Ponderosa pine, the dominant tree above 6,000 feet, is a medium-density softwood with resin content that makes it ignite readily and burn with a hot initial flame. Good for starting the evening fire and raising the cave temperature from its baseline 50 degrees. Burns fast, perhaps 20 minutes per piece to full combustion. Bur oak, the hardwood in the creek draws, is dense, slow-burning, heavy in the hand. Harder to start, but once established it burns for 45 minutes to an hour per piece with sustained heat output. The wood for banking a fire that will sustain itself for 2 to 3 hours with minimal attention. Rebecca stacked the 2 species separately along the west wall inside the cave. Pine on the left, oak on the right. She had cooked over both in summer and knew they burned differently. Separate stacks meant she reached for the right wood at the right time without thinking. She split the oak to approximately 3-inch face width, smaller than standard for a large stove but sized to the shallow firebox of Christopher's cast iron stove. Smaller pieces had more surface area relative to their volume, burned more completely, wasted less. Rebecca had split firewood since she was old enough to swing a maul in Iowa. She knew the split size for a small stove. Her evening protocol refined through October. 2 pieces of pine to start. The resin caught fast. Pine burned hot for 20 minutes, raising the cave to 54 or 55. At that point, the stove was hot enough to ignite dense oak. 2 or 3 pieces of bur oak, selected by weight the heaviest from the densest sections. Each piece sustained 45 minutes. 2 or 3 of them added sequentially sustained the fire for 2 to 3 hours. The cave reached 58 to 60 degrees by bedtime. When the oak burned to coals, Rebecca banked the stove, closed the damper, let the coals die slowly. The cave temperature peaked and began its overnight decline, governed now not by the fire, but by the limestone. Hundreds of pounds of rock that had been absorbing heat for 3 hours and would release it for 12. Total daily consumption, 6 to 8 pieces of mixed pine and oak. Over a 5-month winter, that's 7 pieces average roughly 1,000 pieces. A cord and a half split to 3-inch face contained 12 to 1,400 pieces. She had margin. Not much. Enough. By the end of October, she had approximately 1.5 cords stacked along the west wall. A cord and a half was the honest accounting of what she, pregnant in the 3rd trimester at 7,000 feet, could cut and stack. Not the amount she chose, the amount she could produce. And then Donald Harris walked past. Early October. Harris and an unnamed miner on the trail below. They looked up, saw the woodpile through the cave entrance. Harris's voice carried up the slope clear and certain. "That won't last you to February." The other man said nothing. Rebecca heard. She understood the silence as agreement. Harris was not wrong for his cabin. A cord and a half for a 12 by 14 log cabin gone by December or mid-January. That was 50 years of experience, and the experience was accurate for log cabins. Harris had never heated a limestone cave. His experience did not include the variable he could not see limestone's thermal capacity 4 times that of wood. He was not wrong because he was foolish. He was wrong because his experience had a boundary, and the boundary was invisible. Rebecca did not argue. She had her September measurements. She trusted them not from arrogance, but because specific data is more reliable than general experience when the specific situation differs from the general one. But she was also not 100% certain. She had September data. January was much colder. The cord and a half was the honest arithmetic of her physical limit and a belief based on insufficient but only available data that the cave needed less than a cabin. She would find out in December. What if Harris is right? The thought came at night lying on the raised bed she had built from crate boards in late September. What if the September numbers don't hold in January? What if the cave needs as much wood as a cabin? But the cave held 13 degrees in September with no fire. The cabin would have been same as outside. That's not a small difference. That's the walls. The walls are still stone in January. Stone doesn't change. If it held 13 degrees in September, it should hold in January. Should. But I don't know. I measured September. I didn't measure January, because there hasn't been a January yet. The cord and a half is all I have, and all I can produce. So the question isn't whether it's enough. The question is, will the cave make it enough? She would know in February. Alice was born on November 22, 1876. Rebecca had miscalculated the due date by 3 weeks, or the pregnancy had simply followed its own schedule independent of arithmetic. Either way, the contractions began on a morning when the outside temperature was 28 degrees and the cave was holding at 52 with no fire. She sent the mule down the creek with a note tied to the halter. The note was 4 words in Christopher's pencil on a scrap of provision paper. "Please come. Rebecca Clark." Shirley Allen came when the mule arrived at her cabin. She read the note, left instructions with Kenneth about the evening meal, and walked up the slope carrying a canvas bag with clean cloths and a bottle of whiskey. Not for drinking, for disinfecting. The birth happened at night. The stove burned pine to start oak to sustain. Rebecca on the raised bed she had built in August and September. 4 legs of split pine notched into a frame, covered with crate boards, elevated 18 inches above the stone floor, built specifically because that first night on the limestone floor had taught her the stone drew heat continuously from a body. The bed kept the sleeper above the cold. Shirley managed the delivery with the efficiency of a woman who had done this 11 times before. No wasted movement, no unnecessary words. She told Rebecca when to push and when to wait and when to breathe. And Rebecca, who had never done this before, followed instructions because Shirley's voice carried the weight of experience. The contractions came in waves. Rebecca counted them the way she counted everything, silently, precisely filing the information. 7 minutes apart, then 5, then 3. The cave temperature held steady at 58 degrees. Outside it was 20, 38 degrees warmer inside than out. Without Christopher. With a woman 7 months widowed, and a neighbor who had walked up in the dark because a mule arrived with a 4-word note. No complications. The birth was as straightforward as any birth can be, which is to say it was brutal and ordinary and miraculous all at once. Emily was born. Cried. The sound filled the cave, the first cry the limestone walls had ever absorbed and would hold in their molecular structure alongside the heat from the stove and the cold from the January nights to come. Shirley wrapped Emily in the wool blanket from Iowa, the blanket Angela Young had given Rebecca, the blanket that had traveled from Council Bluffs to the Black Hills on the back of the mule Christopher said not to sell. The blanket was soft from years of washing and warm from being stored near the stove. Emily's crying stopped when the wool touched her skin. The thermometer on the bed read 58 degrees. Outside, approximately 20, a November night in the Black Hills. 27 degrees warmer inside the cave than outside. Rebecca looked down at Emily, 6 pounds, maybe 7, red-faced and squalling and alive, and the arithmetic changed. From now, every piece of wood, every hour of fire, every degree of temperature counted for 2. The first night after Emily was born, Shirley slept on the floor near the stove. She refused the bed. "I have slept on harder floors than this." Her voice was matter-of-fact. Rebecca lay on the bed with Emily wrapped in wool. The stove burned low. The cave was warm, and Rebecca heard a new sound, Emily's breathing. The first breath she had heard beside her own in this space since July when Christopher was alive. 5 months of being the only person breathing in the cave. Now there were 2. Shirley stayed 3 days. She showed Rebecca how to nurse, how to burp, how to swaddle, how to check if Emily was too warm or too cold by touching the back of her neck, how to clean the umbilical stump. Practical instruction delivered in the same tone Shirley used for everything calm, factual. Assuming Rebecca was capable of learning, because everyone is capable of learning if the teacher doesn't waste time. On the 3rd day, Shirley packed her canvas bag and prepared to leave. "You'll do fine." It wasn't encouragement. It was assessment. Rebecca nodded. Shirley walked down the slope toward her own cabin, where Kenneth would have let the fire die down too low and would need reminding to bank it properly. December 1876. The winter opened with 2 weeks of temperatures dropping to -15 on the coldest nights. Rebecca's daily system formed from repetition. Morning carry 6 to 8 pieces from the west wall stack. No more than planned for the day. This was the habit of a person with a fixed supply and no way to increase it. She could not go out and split in -15 air with a newborn in the cave. The habit made her attentive to the rate of consumption in a way that the prospectors who could cut more when they ran short were not. Morning burn. 2 hours while feeding Emily. When Emily slept, let the fire subside. The cave would hold 48 to 50 degrees through the middle of the day without fire. Warm enough for Rebecca in her wool dress. Warm enough for Emily wrapped in the blanket. Evening pine to start. Oak to sustain. 3 to 4 hours. Cave reaching 58 to 60 by bedtime. Bank the stove. Close the damper. Sleep. Morning 43 to 48 degrees. No fire. Emily woke twice in the night to nurse. Each time Rebecca unwrapped her just enough to feed, then wrapped her tight again. The wool held Emily's body heat the way the limestone held the stove's heat. Different materials, same principle. The stove pipe and fissure worked well under most conditions. When the stove burned, warm air rose through the fissure, pulling smoke with it. When the fire went out, the fissure sealed itself. Its geometry directed cold outside air along the ceiling of the crack and back out rather than down into the cave. Rebecca confirmed this by holding her palm under the pipe joint with the fire out. No cold draft from above, except on north wind days. Strong north wind across the fissure exit created a pressure drop, reducing the draw. Those days Rebecca kept the fire lower and opened the door slightly for makeup air. She had learned this the 3rd week of October, recognized the conditions by the sound of wind on the stone wall and the behavior of smoke at the pipe joint. By December she knew before lighting the fire whether today was a north wind day. The sound of wind on the dry stone wall was not a whistle, not a howl, but a complex rushing noise that varied with wind speed, wind direction, and the moisture content of the air. Wind from the south, the prevailing direction in the warmer months, produced a low, steady rushing that indicated normal conditions and good fisher draw. Wind from the west produced a higher pitch sound with intermittent gusts that created pressure variations at the door. She could feel the door pulse slightly inward and outward as gusts passed. Wind from the north, the dangerous direction, the direction that affected the fisher draw, produced a distinctly different sound. A sharper, more insistent rushing with a harmonic undertone that Rebecca came to recognize as the sound of air being pulled across the fissure exit on the hillside above. When she heard the north wind sound, she knew before lighting the evening fire that today was a day to burn lower and crack the door for make-up air. She did not consciously catalog these sounds or assign them labels. She simply heard them, and her body responded with the appropriate fire management, the way a person driving a familiar road adjusts speed for a curve without consciously thinking curve ahead. The knowledge was in the ear and the hand, not in the conscious mind. While Rebecca burned 4 hours in the evening and slept through the night, Kenneth Walker, a quarter-mile away, woke at 2 in the morning to rebuild the fire every night all winter. Shirley told Rebecca during her visits she came once a week now more to see Emily than to check on Rebecca, though she would not have admitted this. Kenneth's 2.5 cords from October were gone by the end of December. Shirley's voice held no judgment, just reporting facts. He went back out in January in -15 air, hands cracking red, the cough starting. Rebecca said nothing. There was nothing to say. Kenneth was doing what he knew how to do. He had built cabins in 5 mining camps and heated them all the same way. The fact that this particular winter he was burning through wood faster than expected was a problem he solved by cutting more wood. It was a reasonable solution. It was also evidence that his cabin was losing heat at a rate he had not calculated for. 2 other men on the creek ran through their wood by February, abandoned their claims temporarily, went to Deadwood to buy firewood at $3 a cord. Same winter, same elevation, same fuel species, same starting month. The cabin exhausted in December, the cave still supplied in February. On a morning in late December, Rebecca carried Emily outside for the first time since her birth. The temperature was 32 degrees. The sun was bright on the limestone slope. Rebecca wrapped Emily in the wool blanket and in a second layer of canvas and held her against her chest where her body heat would keep the baby warm. Emily's eyes opened wide at the light. She had spent her first month in the cave where the only light came from the stove fire and the dim glow through the plank door on sunny days. This was the first time she had seen the sky. She did not cry. She looked up at the blue above and the white clouds and the dark shapes of the pines on the ridge. Rebecca stood there for 5 minutes letting Emily see the world and then carried her back inside where the cave held 50 degrees with no fire and the walls were patient and the winter was long, but the arithmetic was holding. The cave did not care that a child had been born in it. The limestone did not adjust its thermal properties for the presence of an infant, but the effect was the same as if it had. Emily spent her first winter in an environment that never dropped below 40 degrees. No cabin on French Creek could make that claim. Kenneth Walker's cabin hit 22 degrees on the coldest mornings. Other cabins hit 15. Some hit 10. Emily did not know she was living in unusual circumstances. An infant does not compare. She had nothing to compare it to. The sound of wind on the dry stone wall was the sound of the world. The warmth of the stove in the evening was how evenings worked. The cool air of the morning was what mornings felt like. She did not know that mornings in log cabins felt like 22 degrees, that men woke at 2 in the morning to rebuild fires, that hands cracked and bled from cutting wood in the cold. She knew the world she was given. Stone, warmth, wool, her mother's voice. The particular quality of light in a cave, not dark as people who have never been in a habited cave, imagine but a specific half-light during the day when the door was open. Warm and golden when the stove burned in the evening, and a deep, peaceful dark at night that was windless and still and held its temperature steady the way a cupped hand holds water. Rebecca talked to Emily constantly, not in the self-conscious way of modern parenting advice, but in the way a woman alone in a cave talks to the only other person present. Pine first, then oak. Pine is fast. Oak is slow. She would say this, reaching for the left stack in the morning, then the right. Emily did not understand the words. She understood the voice. The voice was steady, calm, factual. The same voice that had read the thermometer in September. That had told Shirley the stone holds it in February. It was the voice of a person who described the world as it was without decoration. Emily did not get sick that winter. She did not get sick the following winter either. In 2 years in a limestone cave in the Black Hills, she was never ill. The diseases most likely to kill an infant in a mining camp, respiratory infections from cold exposure, dysentery from contaminated water, were mitigated by the cave's thermal stability and by Rebecca's practice of boiling creek water before use, a habit learned from her mother in Iowa, who had learned it from the cholera outbreak of 1854, which taught survivors to distrust unboiled water. Rebecca did not know germ theory. She knew her mother boiled water, and her mother's children lived, and the neighbors who did not lost children. That was sufficient evidence. She boiled the water. Emily did not get sick. The outcome was clear. The child lived. January 1877. The month that would test whether Rebecca's September measurements held true when the temperature dropped 40 degrees below what she had measured. The month that would prove whether Donald Harris was right or whether the stone was different enough from wood that his 50 years of experience did not apply. The first week of January brought temperatures of -10 to -15. Rebecca's system held. Evening fire 3 to 4 hours. Cave reaching 58 to 60. Overnight dropped to 44 to 46. Morning fire 2 hours. Cave reaching 52 to 54. Let fire die. Cave holding 48 to 50 through the day. Emily warm in wool. Rebecca warm enough in her dress with the shawl her mother had packed. Wood consumption steady at 7 pieces per day. The arithmetic was working. And then the second week of January brought the cold that makes miners write letters home about the inhuman conditions of the Black Hills winter. The cold that sends men from their cabins to the rooming houses in Deadwood despite the cost. The cold that cracks cabin logs and freezes water in buckets and makes breath visible indoors. The thermometer outside Rebecca's cave read -18 on the morning of January 10th. Inside, with no fire since midnight, the cave held 42 degrees. 42 was lower than she had measured all winter, but it was still 42, 20 degrees warmer than Kenneth Walker's cabin that same morning with fire the night before. 28 degrees warmer than some of the cabins downstream where men had already given up and gone to Deadwood. Rebecca added 1 extra piece of oak to the evening fire that night, 5 pieces instead of 4. The cave reached 61 at bedtime. The overnight drop was larger 18 degrees, but the morning low was 44, back in the range she had measured in September. 1 piece of oak, 45 minutes of additional burn time, 3 degrees warmer in the morning. The system was tunable. She could adjust the input and predict the output. This is what engineers call a linear system. The output is proportional to the input, and it is the kind of system that a person with a thermometer and a pencil and brown paper can manage effectively without knowing anything about engineering. February 1877. Shirley Allen stepped through the plank door on its leather hinges. She looked around the cave. She looked at the wood pile along the west wall. Rebecca had used approximately 2/3 of the cord and a half. 1/3 remained. The rate showed surplus through March. "You have more than I thought you would." Shirley's voice carried surprise. "Not much, but enough to notice." Rebecca looked up from where she sat with Emily. "The cave stays warm at night." "I have heard that. I thought it was something people said. In January the outside was 15 below and the cave was 43 when I woke up." No fire. Shirley was quiet. She was calculating. Her eyes moved to the walls, the ceiling, the stone that surrounded them. Then back to Rebecca. "My husband's cabin was 22 degrees when he woke up, with fire the night before. The stone holds it." Shirley's response came after a pause, and when it did, it carried the weight of understanding. "I can see that it does." Shirley did not go home and build her husband a cave. There was no cave to build. She possessed the understanding but not the means to act on it. And Shirley was the kind of woman who knew the difference between those two things and did not confuse them. She filed it. No envy, no excessive surprise. Observation, registration, continuation. She was the most practical woman Rebecca had met in the Black Hills, and her practicality expressed itself not in dramatic action but in the steady refusal to pretend that understanding a thing and being able to use a thing were the same. Emily had not taken cold all winter. She had never been in a space below 40 degrees. The wool blanket, the raised bed, the cave holding. Steady conditions not comfortable by any modern standard, but sufficient by the only standard that mattered. The child was alive. Spring came to French Creek with the sound of water. Snow on the limestone slopes melted, and water ran down to the creek along paths Rebecca had watched all winter from the cave mouth. Water following cracks in rock, finding the lowest point, never going up. Water and heat shared that character. They moved from where there was more to where there was less, and nothing persuaded them otherwise. March. Rebecca had surplus firewood, and the rate of consumption showed she would not need most of it. The cave held 50 degrees naturally when outside was 35 to 40, and 50 degrees with a wool blanket was sufficient. Rebecca had lived long enough with the word sufficient that she no longer needed the word comfortable. Emily was 4 months old now, healthy. She had survived the entire first winter without illness. This was not miracle, this was physics. The child had never been in a space below 40 degrees, was wrapped in wool, slept on a raised bed in a space where temperature oscillated between 43 and 60. Not a hospital room, but also not a log cabin with frost on the interior walls at 2 in the morning. On warm days, Rebecca carried Emily outside, sat on the flat rock by French Creek, the same rock where she had done the arithmetic the previous July. This time she did not calculate. She sat with Emily on her lap and watched the creek. This was the first time in 9 months she had not been thinking something specific, and the absence of calculation in her head was the clearest sign that winter was over. Shirley visited more often in the spring. The two women sat outside the cave mouth on warm afternoons, Shirley holding Emily while Rebecca washed clothes. They did not talk much. The relationship between them was not built on words. It was built on things they had both seen without needing to retell. In the spring of 1877, Rebecca wrote to her mother, the first letter sent to Angela Young in Council Bluffs since Christopher had died. Nearly a year of silence. Nearly a year in which Angela did not know whether her daughter was alive or dead, because the nearest post office was in Deadwood 2 hours' walk, and Rebecca had not left the cave with a newborn through the winter. And before the winter she had not known what to write that would not create a reaction she could not manage from 700 miles away. Because if she wrote the truth, Christopher is dead, I am living in a cave with a newborn. What would Angela do? She would worry. But worry from Council Bluffs did not wash clothes, did not split wood, did not hold heat in a limestone cave. Worry from 700 miles was weight without function, heavy but lifting nothing. And Rebecca had carried enough weight without function already, so she chose her words the way she chose stones for the wall. Each word needed a flat face, needed to fit, needed to hold without mortar. She did not use the word cave. She wrote, a good stone house built into the hillside, warmer than any wooden house I have lived in. The fire is needed only in the evenings and mornings. Stone house, not a lie, an omission. And the part she omitted, cave, was the word her mother would hear differently than Rebecca lived it. To Rebecca, cave meant dry, stable, warm. To Angela, cave would mean dark, damp, dangerous. Same word, two worlds. Rebecca chose the word that belonged to both worlds. Angela wrote back. Was the stone house sturdy? 4 words in reply. The walls are 10 feet thick. And Angela did not write back about the walls. 10 feet. If built by human hands, absurd. If natural stone, the hillside itself, then ordinary. Angela was not a foolish woman. She may have understood. She may have chosen not to understand because understanding would have required her to do something with the knowledge 700 miles away, with no money to send and no way to arrive. Sometimes silence is love disguised as restraint. Sometimes not asking is the only form of caring that distance permits. Rebecca did not return to Iowa in the spring of 1877. 3 reasons. First, money. Income from washing was enough for weekly provisions, not enough to accumulate. Second, the cave was adequate. The cave was cool in summer, 54 degrees, when outside was 80, the same thermal property working in reverse. The stone was too massive to follow the seasons. It held its own temperature the way a heavy boat holds its position in choppy water by being too heavy for the waves to move. Third, leaving required knowing where to go. Her brother Brandon had not yet written to invite her. Her parents' house was small, 3 younger sisters still at home, and her father did not have surplus income. Rebecca would not return as a burden. In the summer of 1877, she improved the cave. A second shelf, a tighter seal on the stovepipe joint, and most importantly, 2 cords of firewood for the following winter. Not 1.5. 2. Because now she knew from actual data that 1.5 cords was sufficient but tight. 2 cords provided margin, and she was no longer pregnant. Her body was stronger. The splitting did not require 3 rest breaks per morning. The second winter, 1877 to 1878, was easier than the first. Not because the weather was easier, it was not. The temperatures reached the same lows, the winds carried the same bite. But Rebecca had data. She knew the cave's daily consumption. She knew when to start pine and switch to oak. She knew the north wind was coming by the change in pitch on the stone wall. She knew Emily slept well above 50 degrees, fussed below 45, and adjusted the evening fire accordingly. The second winter she had surplus wood into April. She had known she would. The knowing was the difference. This is what competence feels like from the inside. Not triumph, not pride, but the quiet confidence that comes from having done a thing once and knowing you can do it again. And the knowledge that the thing works because you understand why it works, even if your understanding is expressed in empirical terms rather than theoretical ones. The physics of why the cave maintained warmer overnight temperatures than the log cabins and why this translated into firewood efficiency follows from 2 properties of limestone, its heat capacity and the geometry of the cave as an enclosure. Heat capacity first. Limestone has a volumetric heat capacity approximately 4 times greater than dry wood. In practical terms, when Rebecca burned the stove for 4 hours and heat radiated into the cave walls, the limestone absorbed 4 times as much thermal energy per cubic foot as a log wall would have absorbed from the same fire for the same duration. The cave walls were a thermal battery. The battery was 4 times larger than a cabin's walls, even if the raw mass of stone and wood had been comparable. But the mass was not comparable. The cave, 12 feet deep, 8 feet tall at the entrance, 6 at the back, 7 feet wide, had roughly 300 square feet of exposed limestone. Assuming only the outermost 2 inches were meaningfully heated each evening, the mass of thermally cycled rock was roughly 800 pounds. 800 pounds of limestone warmed 3 or 4 degrees above its equilibrium temperature of 50 degrees during the evening fire held enough energy to maintain the interior above freezing through a 12-hour night at -15 outside. Kenneth Walker's cabin, 12 by 14 feet 8-inch logs, had a total wall mass of 12 to 1,500 pounds. Wood holds less than half the thermal energy per pound per degree that limestone does. The cabin's effective thermal mass was therefore substantially lower than the cave's, despite the raw weight being comparable. The cabin lost evening heat faster because the wood stored less of it. Geometry second. The cave walls were not thin partitions between heated interior and cold exterior. They were continuous rock 10 to 30 feet from the cave surface to open air. The thermal gradient from 50 degrees inside to -15 outside had to travel through this entire depth. The rate of heat loss was governed by conductivity across 10 to 30 feet of limestone, not across 6 inches of log. The total rate of loss through the cave walls was far lower than through the cabin walls, despite both being in the same external environment. The result, the evening fire simultaneously heated the interior to comfortable temperature and loaded thermal energy into the limestone. That energy released slowly through the night, maintaining the interior well above outside levels until morning. A cabin fire did the same 2 things, but the wood walls stored so little energy and lost what they stored so quickly that the cabin reached outside temperature by 2 in the morning. The cave held 43 degrees at dawn without fire. The cabin held 22 with fire the night before. The difference was the walls. Everything else, the fire, the wood species, the stove, the elevation, the weather, was the same. February, 1878. The coldest night of the second winter came not in January, but in the first week of February. The temperature outside dropped to -20 degrees. Rebecca woke once in the night to nurse Emily, now 15 months old, walking, speaking a few words, and felt the cold pressing against the plank door like a physical presence. She rose in the dark, felt for the stove, opened the damper slightly to see if any coals remained. A faint red glow. She added 2 pieces of oak, left the damper open until she heard the draw strengthen, then adjusted it back and returned to bed. In the morning the thermometer read 41 degrees. 41 was the lowest temperature she had recorded in 2 winters. The stove had gone out around 4 in the morning despite her adding wood at 2. The overnight drop from 60 to 41.19 degrees was the largest she had measured. But 41 was still 41, 31 degrees warmer than -20 outside, and Kenneth Walker's cabin that same morning, Shirley would report later, had reached 12 degrees at dawn, despite Kenneth rebuilding the fire at 2. The cave 41, the cabin 12, 29 degrees of difference. The difference between a child sleeping through the night under wool and a child at risk. The difference between firewood lasting and firewood exhausted. The difference between managing and not managing. At -20, the stone did not lose its properties. The mass did not care about the temperature outside. The mass cared about the temperature inside, and the temperature inside was determined by how much heat the stone had absorbed and how slowly it released it. Both of those things were constants of the material, not variables of the weather. Rebecca noted 41 on the brown paper. She did not panic. She added 1 extra piece of oak to the evening fire that night, 6 pieces instead of 5. The cave reached 62 at bedtime and held 45 by dawn. 1 additional piece of oak, perhaps 50 minutes of additional burn time, had raised the overnight low by 4 degrees. The system was tunable. She could adjust the input and predict the output. And she managed it through February, through the -20 night, through the wind that drove men from their cabins to deadwood rooming houses. Through the month, Donald Harris had said her wood would not reach. Her wood reached February. Her wood reached March. Her wood reached April. The stone held. Spring of 1878. Emily was 17 months old. She walked now, steady on her feet, exploring the cave with the fearlessness of a child who had never fallen far because there was nowhere to fall. She did not know log cabins or Iowa houses or rooms with glass windows. She knew limestone, the light through the plank door, the sound of fire in the cast-iron stove, the sound of wind on stone. That was her world, and in that world she was safe. In the spring of 1878, Rebecca had been living in the limestone cave for 20 months. She had arrived in August 1876 as a temporary refugee, a pregnant widow with no money and no alternatives. And she had remained through 2 winters because leaving required resources she did not have and a destination she had not identified. But somewhere during the second winter, the cave had stopped being temporary. Not because Rebecca decided it was permanent. She did not make that decision. She made no decision about permanence at all. The cave stopped being temporary because it started being familiar. She knew where to put her hand in the dark to find the stove. She knew the sound of the fissure drawing well versus drawing poorly. She knew the exact height of the door opening 4 feet because she had banged her head on the lintel exactly once in October 1876, and never again. She knew the spot on the west wall where the woodpile started, and the spot where it ended, and the gap between them was a measure of the winter's progress that she could read by touch in the dark. Familiarity is not the same as home, but it is the foundation on which home is built, and by spring of 1878 the foundation was deep. When Brandon Scott's letter arrived in October 1878, offering a place in Council Bluffs, Rebecca's response was not relief. It was calculation. She did not seize the opportunity the way a person desperate to leave seizes an escape. She waited. The letter had come by way of a prospector passing through Deadwood who agreed to deliver mail to French Creek for 25 cents per letter. Brandon's handwriting was the same slanted script Rebecca remembered from when he had helped their father keep accounts in the blacksmith shop. The paper was good quality. The words were careful. Council Bluffs. Room in his house for Rebecca and Emily. Work for her in his household. Carol had just had their second child. They needed help. This was not charity. Brandon needed assistance. Rebecca needed a place. Two needs fitting together the way flat-faced stones fit in a dry stone wall. For the first time in 2 years, Rebecca's arithmetic had an answer other than stay. Savings from 2 years of washing, not much, but some. Sell the mule in Cheyenne at higher price than in Deadwood, enough for stage and rail. Council Bluffs had school for Emily. Family. Future beyond subsistence, laundry, and limestone. The cave had none of these things. The arithmetic was clear. But arithmetic does not account for familiarity, and leaving the cave meant leaving the one place where Rebecca had proven to herself and to the stone that she could manage. She did not speak about this. There was no one to speak to about it. Shirley would have understood, but Shirley was not the kind of person you discussed feelings with. Shirley was the kind of person you discussed temperatures and woodpiles with. Rebecca processed the leaving the way she processed everything, by doing the calculation and following the result. The result said, go. She went. But when she stacked the surplus firewood by the creek bank, pine left, oak right, she stacked it with the care of a person leaving something for someone who would need it. And the care was not impersonal. She had burned from that wood pile every morning and every evening for 2 winters. She knew the weight of each species in her hand. She knew the sound of pine catching and the sound of oak sustaining, and the silence of a banked stove at midnight. She left the wood the way you leave a tool in a workshop when you know someone else will use the workshop after you. Clean, organized, ready. The cave did not know she was leaving. The limestone did not register her departure. It would hold the same temperature for the next person the way it had held it for her, because temperature is not personal, and stone does not grieve, and the physics of heat capacity operate independent of the people who benefit from them. But Rebecca knew she was leaving, and she knew the cave had held. She left the cave substantially as she had made it, the dry stone wall still standing, the door on its leather hinges cracked now but functional, the raised bed, the shelf with its few possessions, and the firewood carried to the creek bank stacked for whoever came next. She did not leave a note. Whoever needed the cave would understand what the cave needed the way Rebecca had understood. Put your hand on the stone. Feel. Measure. Trust what you measure. Rebecca left the Black Hills in October 1878 with the cast-iron stove on the mule's back, the thermometer in the possibles bag, and Emily 2 years old, healthy, never once sick, never once below 40 degrees, riding beside the stove. Wrapped in the blanket Angela Young had given her daughter on a January wedding day in Iowa. When Rebecca left, Shirley was the last person she spoke to on French Creek. They stood outside the cave in the October sun. Emily was playing with a pine cone, dropping it and picking it up over and over with the infinite patience of a 2-year-old discovering gravity. You did well. Shirley's voice was quiet. Rebecca looked at the cave mouth, the dry stone wall she had built 7 months pregnant. The door hung on leather hinges, the opening that led to the space where she had measured and calculated and kept a child alive through 2 Black Hills winters. The cave helped. Shirley shook her head, not in disagreement but in correction. The cave was there for a lot of people. You were the one who used it. This was the most precise summary of the entire 2 years that anyone ever produced. The cave was geology. The using was Rebecca. Shirley saw the distinction clearly, expressed it simply, and walked back to her husband's log cabin where the fire would need rebuilding at 2 in the morning as it always did, because the cabin was wood and wood does not hold. The journey from the Black Hills to Council Bluffs took 3 weeks. The mule carried the stove the way it had carried the stove, coming steady and patient. Emily rode some days, walked some days, always curious about the changing landscape. She had never seen this much space before. The cave had been her universe, 12 feet deep, 7 feet wide. Now the world was endless grassland and sky. Rebecca watched her daughter discover distance and thought about the walls that had kept Emily safe. Stone walls 10 feet thick that absorbed heat in the evening and released it through the night. Stone walls that did not care whether a child lived or died, but which through the simple operation of physical law had kept that child at a temperature where living was possible. They arrived in Council Bluffs in early November 1878. Brandon met them at the rail station. He looked older than Rebecca remembered, though it had only been 2.5 years. His hair had thinned. His face had the weathered look of a man who worked outdoors. He looked at Rebecca, then at Emily, then at the mule with the cast-iron stove on its back. "You kept it." "The stove?" "Yes." "Christopher said to." Brandon nodded. He did not ask about Christopher. Rebecca did not offer. Some things are understood without words. Brandon's house was larger than their parents' house had been. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, a kitchen with a proper stove larger than the camp stove built into a brick hearth. Rebecca looked at it and thought about the 40 pounds Christopher had insisted on bringing, the shallow firebox sized for a farmhouse kitchen, the pipe that had fit perfectly into a fissure in a limestone cave ceiling. Carol was kind, tired from the new baby, but kind. She showed Rebecca the room she and Emily would share. A real bed, a window with glass, a door that closed. Rebecca stood in the doorway and thought about how much space there was and how little of it touched stone. That first night in Council Bluffs, Rebecca lay in the bed with Emily beside her. The room was warm. The stove downstairs heated the whole house through metal grates in the floors. But the warmth felt different. It came and went with the fire. When the fire died, the warmth left. The walls held nothing. Rebecca got up twice in the night to check on Emily, even though Emily was sleeping fine. It was the habit of 2 years in a cave where temperature mattered and measurement was survival. The habit would fade eventually, but not yet. The cave above French Creek is still there. Limestone does not leave. The dry stone wall may still be standing, or it may have fallen weather frost. Heave the root of a ponderosa pine growing into the joint between 2 carefully placed stones. The slow, patient dismantling that nature performs on everything humans build given enough time. The stovepipe fissure still draws if anyone fits a pipe into it. The geometry has not changed. The temperature inside on a July afternoon when the outside air is 80 degrees is approximately 54 degrees. Cool, not cold. The intermediate temperature that stone holds when insulated from surface swings by its own mass. If you put your hand on the interior wall, you will feel what Rebecca Clark felt on July 21, 1876, 7 days after her husband died. Cool limestone under your palm. The stone does not know your name. It does not know hers. It holds the temperature it has always held for whoever needs it, held for as long as limestone lasts, which is to say for a very long time. The brown paper with the numbers was never found. It existed for a certain time in a certain possibles bag, and then it did not. 54, 51, 62, 44, 48, 31, 6 numbers, 2 winters, 1 child who lived. Christopher Wright, on his 8th day of fever, had said stove and mule. The stove heated the cave. The mule carried them out. There are ways of loving that do not require the word and work better than the word ever could. Rebecca Clark left the Black Hills in October 1878 with the cast-iron stove on the mule's back, the thermometer in the possibles bag, and Emily, 2 years old, healthy, never once sick, never once below 40 degrees, riding beside the stove. Her grandfather had always had on the mule. Her father said not to sell, wrapped in the blanket her grandmother had given her mother on a January wedding day in Iowa. The stone held the heat. She held the stone. Emily lived. That was enough.